morning. Today we'll discuss the function of poetry as Wordsworth has prescribed in the lyrical ballads or the preface to the lyrical ballads. So, first is what is the conception of poetry and what are its function? So, Wordsworth had an exalted conception of his own views on poetry. In the preface, he calls poetry, quote, the most philosophical of all writings, the breath and finer spirit of all knowledge, unquote, the impassioned expression that is the continence of all science, the image of man and nature, etc. And even in one of his letters, he writes, every great poet is a teacher. I wish either to be considered as a teacher or as a nothing. So, in one of these passages, he writes that poetry has its value and significance in framing models to improve the scheme of man's existence and recast the world. So, Wordsworth tells us in the preface that the function of poetry is to produce excitement in coexistence with an overbalance of pleasure. In his emphasis on pleasure is the primary aim of poetry. Wordsworth differs from the neoclassical poets who considered that the aim of poetry was both to instruct and delight. Wordsworth just focuses or emphasizes on the pleasure part of poetry. Thus, the proper function of poetry is to give pleasure, but Wordsworth's concept of pleasure is not pure aesthetic one. His concept of pleasure is moral. Poetry does not merely provide momentary pleasure, as is provided by some activities like drinking or playing. Poetry provides us this by using meter, rhyme, and other extended or external aids which temper and soften the painful emotions. But such pleasure is not the real aim of poetry. Its aim is to realize the truth. It is the pleasure which results from inner enlightenment and from the strengthening of and purification of the emotions which poetry aims at. So, poetry makes the readers saner and purer than they were actually before reading that poetry. So, poetry enlightens the understanding of the viewer or the reader. All good poetry, Wordsworth tells us, is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and the poems to which any value can be attached were never produced on any variety of subjects, but by a man who, being possessed of more than usual organic sensibility, had also thought long and deeply. For our continued influx, feelings are modified and directed by our thoughts, which are indeed the representatives of all our past feelings. So, in this way are discovered the general and universal laws of human life and nature, which when rendered in poetry enlighten the understanding and purify the emotions. Wordsworth hoped that his poems would operate to extend the dominion of sensibility for the delight, honor, and benefit of human nature. He trusted that it was their destiny to console the afflicted soul, to add sunshine to daylight by making the happier, to lead the young and the gracious of every age to see, to think, and to feel, and therefore to become more actively and securely virtuous. So, a poet looks before and after, that what impact his poetry would have. He talks about the defense for human nature, an upholder and preserver of man, carrying everywhere with him relationship and love. So the poet performs this function by discovering universal laws of human nature and communicating them to his readers. In spite of the difference of climate and language and manners of and laws and customs, the poet binds together by his passion and knowledge the vast empire of human society. As it is spread over the entire universe, other function of poetry is that it spiritualizes science. Poetry is the first and the last of all knowledge. It is as immortal as the heart of man. Wordsworth emphasizes the fact that if the labors of man of science should ever create any material revolution, poetry will then act as the complement to science. In the preface, Wordsworth states that the human mind is capable of being excited without the application of gross and violent stimulants, and that when one is being elevated above another, in proportion as he possesses this capability, and in his view, to endeavor to produce or enlarge this capability is one of the best services a poet can be engaged into. Poetry should purify the taste of the public and should awaken their sensibility. Wordsworth had an invincible faith that his poetry discovered the truth of nature, and by reason of widened sensibility, its fresh discovery of the truth of nature and the new pleasure it gave. To discover something fresh and original in the manifold beauty of nature and in the mind of man, and to teach or communicate the truth to his readers, that his thought was the mission of poetry. So then there is poetry that has universal appeal. It can give pleasure to thousands of people all around, all over the world, because it talks about the same emotions, same sensibilities which all the world feels. So poetry gives pleasure because, like science, it also pursues truth, and truth, when discovered and communicated, is always pleasurable. It increases our knowledge of human life and human nature, and so makes us much more wiser and nobler than we are. Its truths are discovered not through the meddling of the intellects, but through imagination and intuition, and so its truths are universal and general, while the truths of science are merely personal and particular. Then the poet is like a teacher, and he appeals to the emotions of the people. It is for all these reasons that poetry is an immense force of good. Wordsworth's own object in writing poetry was, quote, to console the afflicted, to add sunshine to daylight by making the happy happier, to teach the young and the gracious of every age to see, to think, and to feel, and therefore to become more actively and securely virtuous. Unquote. So in his view, every great poet is a teacher, and this is also what Plato had said, with whom Wordsworth had much in common, because he wanted poetry to do that later everywhere insists on pleasure as being a necessary condition of poetic teaching. So Wordsworth, in a famous passage in a letter concerning his own poem, seems to echo the very sentiments of Plato, where he says, quote, they will cooperate with the benign tendencies in human nature in society, and will in their degree be efficacious in making men wiser, better, and happier, unquote. So in the preface, these benign tendencies are defined as relationship and love, which is the great function of poetry, to rather than through a mere appeal to the intellect or good sense. In this way, his teaching is different from the instruction of the classics, and he reconciles pleasure and instructions and fuses them into a whole in his poetry. Thank you.